a roll call. Mr. Price.
Can I please ask all committee members to turn their camera on?
Could all committee members online turn on your cameras, please?
All right, thank you. Roll call. Brent Rubin.
Here.
Brent.
I'm here. Can y'all hear me?
Thank you. Deborah Carpenter.
Present.
Jasmine Anderson. Jerry Hawkins.
Present.
Krista Nightingale. Linda McMahon. Lynette Aguilar. Matt Houston.
Here.
Peter Goldstein. Roy Lopez. Nathaniel Barrett. Here. Jennifer Scripps.
Present.
Joe Cannon.
Here.
Colin Yarbrough. We have 8. Just a reminder, committee members online, please keep your camera on because we are at quorum right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Price. The next item on the agenda is the Forward Dallas Implementation Plan Review. Mr. Review.
All right, good morning. Thank you all for joining us today. So today's meeting is going to be focused on implementation items that are being developed by the project team. Brian Price will be the one walking us through today's presentation. But before we get to that presentation, just want to give a quick update in terms of timeline for the next few months, just to kind of get everybody up to speed with what we're doing. And I'll come back again at the end of this meeting to remind us of what we're doing as well. But from now till August, the project team will be working on developing the draft plan for you all to review later on in the summer. What we want to do as we continue to send piecemeal documents, specifically the place type draft language, we want you all to review that and send that back to us. Quick update on the timeline for getting that back to us. We mentioned last time we met, at the end of the month, we'd like to receive some of those back. We're going to extend that till mid-July. That'll be July 14th, tentatively. So as we keep sending you all information, July 14th would be the date that we'd like to receive the reviewed information back to us. So we'll delve a little bit deeper in terms of the project schedule at the end of this meeting, but I just want to give a quick update for those currently working on materials. So with that, I'm going to actually pass the baton to Brian Price, and we'll discuss our implementation items today.
I hop in with a quick question, Mr. Agu.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. So far, we've just received the industrial draft, right? Are there other drafts that we've received? I've only seen one.
No, so you'll be receiving more in the next few weeks. That's why we're extending that deadline.
Okay, great.
Is that because of the hack that we spent a little time not receiving the maps?
Excuse me?
Was it because of the hack that occurred to the city that we haven't received? I think it was supposed to be monthly updated maps.
Oh, the maps? Oh, sorry. So
yeah.
Related to the maps, sorry, I couldn't hear you too well in terms of what you're saying, but related to the maps, just due to the ransomware attack that the city had a few months ago, we were 2 months behind in terms of publishing that. So what we're doing is we're going to be publishing a comprehensive map update beginning of July. That's our schedule, and that's going to include everything that we've heard so far from the community, other stakeholders, and you all in the last few months. So just because of the ransomware attack, we were delayed 2 months, so we're going to just roll everything into the next update.
Right, that's what I was thinking. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Any other questions? All right, hand over to Brian Price.
Thank you, Lawrence. So as Lawrence said, I will be presenting on the implementation plan portion of the Forward Dallas plan. Just a couple comments about the implementation portion. This is one of the components of the plan that we've intentionally focused on from the beginning of the process as something that would be improved and enhanced from the 2006 Forward Dallas process. It was our goal to have an implementation plan that is actionable and that has involved constant communication with partners that are involved in it, with specific deliverables and timeframes. So this has always been a priority for Forward Dallas from the beginning. The other component here that's important to note is that we've had several other adopted policies in the last 2 to 3 years. So we have the benefit of being able to coordinate with and speak to a lot of these plans to provide land use component to the implementation of Forward Dallas and to be able to interact with those other functions as well. So the outline for today, what we're going to do, I'm going to briefly overview the Forward Dallas land use themes, which are kind of the value framework for the plan and is also the framework for the implementation plan. And then I'm going to go through the implementation plan itself. I'm going to do an overview of all 6 themes, and then we're going to go one by one and have a discussion about the items. And then there'll be a brief next steps portion, and then that will be the meeting. So the land use policy themes, you've seen us present about these on more than one occasion. But just as a kind of an overview, the function and role of these themes is, as I said before, the primary value framework for Forward Dallas. It's incorporated into the place type map and the development of the place type descriptions, which you've already been briefed on and is ongoing. But for today, what we're going to focus on are the land use themes as the organizing framework for the implementation plan itself. The theme framework is also going to provide guideposts for after the plan is adopted for ongoing plan reporting and monitoring as well. You've seen a couple of these slides before, but this is just a reminder of some of the background on the policy themes. The themes themselves were developed through extensive community engagement in 2020 and last year. So we had extensive meetings with the community just on the topic of what are the priorities that are important to them. We had several workshops. We also did extensive surveying. Staff then compiled and distilled that information down to the 6 core themes. The slide that you see now is just a visualization of how we kind of took hundreds and hundreds, thousands really, of data points that the community provided as to what was important for them. We went through really an extensive process of aggregating that information and making sure we were true to the spirit of what was really said by the community in order to get to the 6 themes that you've seen before and that are on the screen now. As a reminder, those themes are environmental justice, housing accessibility, economic development and revitalization, urban design, TOD and connectivity, and rural and agricultural and greenfield areas. So on to the implementation plan itself, the draft implementation plan. So how did we develop this plan? So staff conducted an extensive review of existing adopted plans. So we reviewed all of these plans, sort of scoured them for land use relevance in particular. We did quite a bit of best practice research and then developed preliminary implementation items based on what we've seen from adopted plans, what we've heard from the community, what other cities are doing that has been effective. What we've done then is worked with the technical review committee quite extensively in vetting and exploring these items. So we've had 5 technical review committee meetings. These are the big meetings that include 2 or 3 dozen individuals from our partner departments and other major public entities like DART and the county. But what we did specific to the implementation plan is conduct several more small group discussions with these partners. So over 15 meetings over the last few months with several partners, including Office of Environmental Quality, Housing, Economic Development, Transportation, Office of Equity, DART, the COG. So in many cases, we've had more than one meeting. So what we would do is present to them our preliminary ideas, receive feedback, and go through an iteration process where we work through how to best articulate the intersection of Forward Dallas and land use issues with the other subject matters that they are experts in and have received public feedback and formal policy adoption around. So just for a bit of description as to the nature of this implementation plan, one of the ways we're also slightly different, or rather quite a bit different from 2006 Forward Dallas, is that as a reminder, Forward Dallas, the update is focusing specifically on land use. The original Forward Dallas plan covered several other topics that have since been addressed by these other adopted plans. So the implementation plan, therefore, is designed to specifically focus on the ways that we can improve land use policy and planning here in the city. So what you see on the screen here essentially is kind of a summary of some of the types of tools that we have considered primarily within the wheelhouse of land use issues. So that includes areas of strategic planning, like our area plan program, like the place type map, zoning and code amendments and practices, and also other interdepartmental alignments. How can we align our programs and processes with the work of other departments? Just as a sort of a quick overview, what you're going to see on the PowerPoint today is more of a sort of a single summary of each item, but just know that in the background, the implementation plan itself contains more information about each item. So some of the information that we've been collecting and assembling for each item includes essentially which theme is the item under and which objective within that theme is it categorized within. So that'll become clear when I show the next slides, but each theme essentially has about 2 to 3 subtopics or key objectives, and the implementation items fit within those objectives. We also try to tie the implementation items to some of the specific land use issues within those themes. And then there's a category of development notes. So we keep internal information about additional components that might be needed to explore the topic. We want to definitely capture which other adopted policy plans are relevant to the implementation items, and then also who are the key partners that will be involved in implementing that item. In the final plan, we're also likely to include key components such as timeline and responsibility. So rather than just listing partners, we might specify whose point, whose support, just so that we're really clear on who's on the hook to support which part of the process. So now what I'm going to do is actually go through the plan. I'm going to try to keep this relatively high level. I'm going to cover all 6 themes. I'm going to try to be relatively brief about it. I just want to give you an overall sense of how all these pieces work and how they fit together, and then we'll go back and talk through each theme individually to see if there's feedback or comments or questions. So the first theme I'm going to talk about is environmental justice, which includes environmental justice and equity topics, but also broader citywide sustainability issues. The value statement that we're working from currently is to actively promote and protect environmental sustainability, public health, and equity through our natural systems and built environment. So there are 4 objectives under this theme. The first one is about developing a City of Dallas environmental justice program. This involves primarily working with the Office of Environmental Quality and Sustainability. They are in the process of hiring an environmental justice coordinator and developing a program around environmental justice. Our role will be to provide land use support to that program. So this program will be focused on identifying key areas of environmental justice concern involved in data collection, community engagement. We will be there to help develop land use strategies to help respond to those specific issues. The other item here involves working to review the development code and prioritize stronger environmental impact review for new land use, particularly in these environmental justice areas and areas that the EPA has identified through their data tool as well. So the next objective has to do with mitigating environmental hazards in the built environment. This is different from the next objective. This one's about mitigating active hazards. The next objective is more about proactively protecting key natural assets. So for the mitigating environmental hazards, this has to do with updating the development code and parking ordinance to minimize impervious surfaces, to reduce the urban heat island effect and stormwater runoff, revising the parking ordinance to transition new and existing surface lots from impervious to consider alternative paving solutions, and then as well reviewing the land use and development code to incentivize low impact development strategies, specifically around addressing cumulative stormwater impacts and water quality. Under supporting environmental protection of key natural assets, some of the topics here involve reviewing Article X to encourage greater tree canopy preservation, working with water and wastewater to find innovative solutions to integrate land use planning and watershed protection, and working with OEQS to develop a regulatory mechanism to protect environmentally sensitive areas. So like some kind of overlay potentially. And then the last one here has to do with generating environmentally protective land uses. So this will be working with city departments in particular to look at city-owned land to find ways to encourage green uses. And also to update the development code to allow for community gardens, green linkages, parklets, and urban agricultural initiatives.
May I jump in here? Hello, me, Commissioner Parkin.
Oh,
Yeah.
sure.
Under mitigate environmental hazards in the built environment, this seems to be focusing almost exclusively over water issues and stormwater. And when you start talking about alternative permeable paving solutions, one of the problems in these industrial areas when you're using what has been an alternate paving solution, which is what they call base, is it has a tremendous impact on the air quality in those areas. So I would really like to emphasize when you're talking about mitigating environmental hazards in some of these areas to look at, to not just consider the effect on stormwater and water catchment and all that, but also to look at what the impact is on the surrounding area with the air quality.
Got you. And Chair, would you prefer to maybe just have the discussion after I overview these?
That's fine, however you want to do this. If you want to go through that, that's fine.
And just point of clarification, I forgot to mention this earlier. This will be the only, I guess, meeting we have on this particular topic of implementation. We're still going to be sending you all information. So just for kind of time check and making sure we're kind of on track. I'll probably be the timekeeper today, but I think going through the presentation and having discussions afterwards would be the best way of approaching our meeting today.
Okay, that's fine.
Thank you.
Okay, housing accessibility is the next theme. So this is focusing on increasing housing choice throughout the city, particularly in urban areas, job centers, and transit accessible locations in existing locations, while preserving neighborhood fabric and mitigating displacement. So two main objectives here within this theme: supporting housing choice and affordability throughout the city. So we've met with the housing department multiple times on this topic. So some of the items here include revising the development code to allow for missing middle housing, streamlining the city's development process to simplify housing development, reviewing parking mandates to reduce or remove parking minimums. We're also going to be collaborating with housing on their target areas, which are being developed, so we can hopefully align area planning, land use planning with areas they're going to focus on targeting affordable housing. Some of those areas they focused on, they're talking about may include areas that are at middle level of income or near TODs or job centers. We also have met with them about prioritizing affordable housing, mixed income housing in TOD areas, and then working with them to utilize the place type map to inform housing placement and density, reviewing the land bank program, as well as the housing notice of funding availability, so we can find a way to incorporate planning and design principles into their projects. The other objective here has to do with promoting neighborhood stabilization in areas of displacement risk. So working with housing and their anti-displacement toolkit, which they developed with an outside partner, to help align land use tools with that toolkit. And then exploring new zoning and design standards for high growth areas. And then looking at areas where there is displacement risk and finding the right way to focus housing development in a way that protects certain components of the neighborhood, potentially by providing density or additional housing in appropriate ways around TODs or along major commercial corridors. The next theme has to do with economic development and revitalization. So this has to do with leveraging land use regulation to promote economic growth and sustainable development, focusing on the revitalization of underserved neighborhoods, commercial corridors, and mixed-use job centers. So some of the key initiatives that we have discussed here with the Economic Development Department involve using some of their incentives to help support transit-oriented development, finding ways to identify key commercial corridors and aligning corridor planning with retail and business revitalization, and as well as trying to align some of our land use planning with some of the economic development tools such as the TIF program, and then of course just supporting broader equity issues like finding ways to align economic development incentives with the environmental justice program and helping to support growth and development in traditionally underserved portions of the city. The next theme has to do with community and urban design. And just to note, this theme is actually also a key component of the plan overall. So urban design is going to have its own discussion at some point, but as far as the implementation plan goes, the idea here in general is to establish an overarching design vision for the public spaces in Dallas, focusing on how different places, districts, streets, and open spaces should grow, change, and improve through the intentional use of design. So there are some specific components that have to do with implementation here. So in addition to developing those citywide guidelines and incorporating existing urban design policies, the idea is to then take these, take the vision and guidelines and apply them through city processes, such as the development code, plat and rezoning cases, incorporating design principles into the bond projects, integrating bike trail and park accessibility into the development code. So this item has to do with when new development is built, sometimes they're adjacent to assets like trails or parks. So trying to encourage accessibility from new development to these resources, as well as incorporating Forward Dallas into future park master planning and using our neighborhood planning and area planning process to promote urban design principles in their area focus. The third objective in this one has to do with promoting placemaking and identity in Dallas neighborhoods. So primarily here we are committing to focusing on placemaking and identity within the area plan neighborhood planning process and finding ways to collaborate with other partners such as Office of Cultural Affairs, Economic Development, and others. There's a growing sense that a lot of neighborhoods around the city are really working to identify themselves and create a sense of place, whether it's a business association or neighborhood group or a public improvement district. And so finding ways to help designate areas, help areas call out their identity and create a sense of place. TOD and connectivity, this is one of our major themes that really cuts across in some ways many of the themes and many of the partners that we've met with. So this issue is deeply important to the county, to DART, to housing, to economic development. We've had conversations on this from multiple sides. CCAP calls out transit-oriented development as an essential way to reduce vehicular miles and impact air quality. Housing is interested in providing housing next to transit. And so there's really a sense that we have lots of underutilized space and land around these stations. So it's important to us to articulate a land use and design vision and ultimately work towards a transit-oriented development planning practice that aligns land use and design with some of our other partners' work in helping to enhance and develop these areas adjacent to transit-oriented developments. And just to clarify, while primarily we speak about dark rail stations, we've also explored ways to consider major bus nodes, trails, and bikes as well. We should always consider those modes transit-oriented developments as well. The nature of development is just a bit different around those modes, so we've been gathering best practices around those as well. So under this implementation section, the primary idea is to develop a comprehensive citywide TOD planning strategy and essentially, especially a prioritization framework for land use and zoning updates to help encourage development around these stations, but also to have a sense of vision and design as to what kind of development around these stations is appropriate and how we can best improve connectivity from stations to the development to the surrounding neighborhoods. So some of the items here include partnering with DART. They already have their own sort of typology and planning effort around transit-oriented developments. They've worked with economic development to submit an RFP for some of the land that has been underutilized. There might be future RFPs as well. There's quite a bit of underutilized parking around many of the DART stations in the city of Dallas. So we just want to partner closely with DART and help ways to align where the land use changes are needed with some of the efforts they are undertaking, as well as incorporating, as I mentioned before, housing, economic development, and green infrastructure goals in these TOD areas. We also want to collaborate and support with key partners on strategies for last mile connections, and then evaluate and prioritize rezonings around TOD areas to encourage appropriate development, as well as prioritize parking reductions in TOD areas as appropriate. Other than transit-oriented development, the theme refers to accessibility in general. So the second objective has to do with aligning transportation and land use planning processes. So here, one of the major items is once Forward Dallas and the future place type map is adopted, we want to be able to align that future place type map with a thoroughfare plan. So that might involve a whole-scale thoroughfare plan amendment update, but that is something we've been discussing with transportation plan to make sure that the thoroughfare plan and the road network is compatible with the urban design and land use vision that's set forth. Also to develop strategies for corridor planning with DART and transportation. So I mentioned corridor planning in the economic development theme. So DART and transportation are also interested in corridor planning from a transportation standpoint, in addition to the other topics we've discussed, such as underutilized retail or the need for housing. And then the last one has to do with continuing to collaborate with TxDOT and the COG and the transportation infrastructure partners operating at higher scales to make sure that new infrastructure projects align with neighborhood and land use goals of the city. Lastly, our sixth theme is rural and agricultural and greenfield areas. So this is about guiding and preserving rural character and encouraging protection and restoration of natural assets, open space, and green belts. So some of the items here have to do with creating a rural residential district in the development code, promoting agriculture and cultural and environmental conservation in these rural areas. So helping to encourage agriculture and preserving some of the key natural assets that exist. In particular, when we talk about rural or greenfield areas, we're largely talking about the far southern portion of the city, southeast, southwest, Kleberg, Riley, and others. So finding ways through the code and other city programs to encourage agriculture, but also to explore some kind of preservation overlay. A lot of the city's trees and natural assets also exist in these areas. And then focus on infrastructure and amenity needs. So part of this has to do with, as new development takes place in these areas, just making sure that housing development takes place in a character that is appropriate for these areas. And then identifying key infrastructure and missing amenities. We know that traditionally these parts of the city have been underserved from infrastructure and are missing key amenities. So exploring ways to solve those gaps as well. In addition to the 6 themes, we've been collecting some implementation items that aren't specific to a theme, but kind of cut across all of them. So this list continues to be developed, but some of the main items here have to do with streamlining the development review process. So we have been meeting with development services and know this is an ongoing process. So working through the development process, the development code, to create a more efficient and streamlined process in a way that also factors in meaningfully the kinds of reviews that we've been talking about throughout this process, as well as looking at integrating infrastructure planning with future place type map and place type descriptions. And then the last point here has to do with area planning and just making sure that our future area and neighborhood planning programs speak to these primary goals and implementation items that have been mentioned thus far. So that's the overview. I just wanted to give everyone a general sense of what all the themes are about, so that as we go through these items, you have some context rather than jumping ahead and having to bounce around. So that's the overview of the implementation plan. What we're happy to do now is receive to conduct a conversation here and receive general feedback. What I'm going to do is go through these one by one. I'm also going to attempt, and maybe Lawrence can help me through a time check. So typically, so it looks like we have about an hour, maybe an hour and a half. So I'm going to start with some of the themes that I feel like are going to be heavier on the discussion side. And then I think a couple of them are not going to probably need as much discussion and can be held off till the end. So I'll just keep that in mind so we make sure, since we only have this meeting for this topic, we can make sure we get through all of them. So why don't we go ahead and start with environmental justice and sustainability. And one other point I should make a note of. So this will obviously be sent out to the group, and we will continue to receive feedback from you offline as well. So don't feel like this is the only opportunity to provide feedback. So there's a lot of information here. I've reviewed it in a previous meeting, but I know this is our first time talking about it in depth. So this information will be sent out, and we will be, just like with the place type descriptions, receiving feedback from you offline as well. So we'll go ahead and start with environmental justice and see if we have any questions and comments. And Commissioner Carpenter, I did go ahead and make a note of your first comment about air quality as well. I do know that it's not mentioned here explicitly, but certainly through the environmental justice theme, as well as through the impervious surface issues, those issues definitely do impact air quality. We've been working with OEQS about air issues, so thank you for bringing that back up. It's certainly one of our key priorities, so we'll get ways to make that more explicit in the plan. Do we have other questions or comments on this theme?
Mr. Carpenter?
Yes, Chair Rubin?
Okay. Yeah, one of the things, I've been waist deep in those industrial place types since you wanted our feedback on them by the end of the month. And one of the things that was prevalent, both in those and in lots of discussions we previously had was, addressing incompatible adjacencies between existing industrial uses and existing residential areas. And I don't see a bullet point or a sub-bullet point that specifically calls that out under the mitigation piece, as Commissioner Carpenter referenced. It's all, talking about runoff and green infrastructure and things like that. And, that top bullet point doesn't really seem to address it as directly. Is that something that we need to include? I mean, that's probably something I think that we need to include in there as one of these implementation bullet points, is addressing these environmental industrial incompatibilities.
Thank you for that comment. Do I still call you Chair Rubin in this context?
You can call me whatever you want.
Commissioner Rubin, thank you so much for that comment. So I appreciate the feedback. If that isn't explicit in this plan, we will certainly take a look at it, because it is definitely our intention to make it so. So you mentioned the top bullet point. So a bit of context here. So as I mentioned, OEQS is hiring a staff person specifically for the topic of environmental justice. We are committed to working with not only that staff person in OEQS, but they also have a subcommittee of the CCAP implementing body dedicated to environmental justice. So the idea here is that we will be partnering with them to formally identify areas where those incompatibilities you mentioned exist and to develop appropriate mitigation strategies for those areas. So some of these areas have already been sort of preliminarily identified through our plan and certainly by the public and many of the advocates that have worked really hard to raise the profile of this issue. So it is definitely our concern, not only through the place type descriptions and the future place type map, but also through proactive work of our departments moving forward to find those locations where those incompatibilities exist. And part of the issue is that those incompatibilities look very different from neighborhood to neighborhood. So making sure that we're context sensitive. In some cases, there are noxious uses directly adjacent to residential uses. In some cases, there are barriers. In some cases, the industries are cleaner or operate differently. So sometimes the mitigation strategies might be zoning in nature. Sometimes they might be incentive-based to encourage better practice. Sometimes through the place type descriptions and through ongoing work, it's about better buffering and transitioning uses. But it's certainly the idea of the top 2 bullet points, not only to work with OEQS to identify the areas, to engage those communities, to gather data, but also to explore land use and other toolkit options between us, between OEQS, potentially through economic development and maybe some of their grant programs to make sure we identify where the concern exists within the city, what is the nature of the concern from place to place, what is the right strategy to address it, and then how can we strengthen the development code and the development review process to prioritize this environmental impact review. So I will make sure that in the language, we make that more clear that that is the intention of this objective within the statement.
Great, thank you. Yeah, just the language, the terms concern and developing appropriate mitigation strategy are pretty vague. So I think if we can put our, realizing that there's a array of concerns out there, if we can put our finger on some of the major ones, I think that would go a long way, because these are implementation goals, identifying what the problems are more specifically.
Thank you, Chair Rubin. Comment taken.
I have a question. This is Jerry Hawkins.
Yes.
Excuse me, I'm sitting outside before it turns too hot. But my question is around developing a City of Dallas environmental justice program. I believe there's my frustration always when working with the city or volunteering with the city is that there's a step that's always missing, and that's kind of a historical context step. What are the environmental injustices that are happening that requires an environmental justice program? What has happened in the past to require that? So that's like the first step, and I don't see that on the development of the environmental justice program. Is there kind of a research section to this? Is there a detailing of the environmental injustice before this is developed? And then the other part is, if there's environmental justice needed, there's injustices happening. Like, who is doing the injustices, and when do we find that out? And how do we work with the public to mitigate that? I believe the City of Dallas just did a housing audit, a housing policy audit, and it found that like 49 Black and brown communities were next to industrial use spaces. So there's been some type of research already. How do we incorporate some of those things into this? So I'm just really interested in how is this development of an environmental justice program happening, and where's the research to talk about the injustice that this is required?
Thank you, Committee Member Hawkins. So I will say, as far as the historical context, we did address that a bit more in the narrative of the existing conditions report, and certainly in the final plan for this land use theme, there will definitely be reference to the historic inequalities and conditions that have led us to this point. I think at this point, what we're most focused on is identifying where the issue exists now, understanding the nature of the issue from location to location, and finding the most appropriate way to address the injustices that are existing right now. But I've definitely taken your note down to make
I have to
sure
call
that
it
this
something
isn't
else
just a,
then. Because that's not environmental justice. You might have to call it something different. The word justice literally means taking historical context to task in order to fix an injustice so it won't happen again. So you might have to call it something else.
Hey, Mr. Hawkins, this is Lawrence. I can also help with answering that question. So in terms of Fort Dallas, and we're going to be looking at, I think those land use concerns and the historical concerns, it's all going to be packaged, like Brian mentioned, with our ECR and the final document and the data component that we're going to be looking at. OEQS, they're going to be the drivers with the data component and the historical component, because that's what they're focused on. So we're definitely working with them to make sure we are working hand in hand, but they're going to be the ones that are driving that particular point that we have here. I just want to make sure that we're coordinating in terms of what we're doing in terms of location of certain items, but again, OEQS is going to be the driver for this one.
So can you tell me again? And I'm sorry, I just wanted some clarity, so I won't be asking the wrong question.
Right.
As far as this thing goes, what will be the because it has developed in the first topic, and so I'm wondering what is the task in the development of the City of Dallas Environmental Justice Program.
So, so as I mentioned before, OEQS is hiring a staff person focused on this topic. There's also a subcommittee of the CCAP implementing body. And so what we're doing is working with their department, because we know that issues of environmental justice, in some senses, primarily a land use issue. It's about what industrial uses or other noxious uses exist on the ground in proximity to residential neighborhoods, in particular, residential neighborhoods that are traditionally neighborhoods of color, traditionally lower income neighborhoods. And the data certainly reflect that within the City of Dallas, industrial uses are almost exclusively placed in these kinds of neighborhoods. So the idea is that we're going to be partnering with them and EPA has developed a data tool that's become widely used around the country now that combines a lot of environmental and social data sets and health data sets. So they're using that tool as well. So we're coordinating with them in formally identifying the areas and differentiating the nature of the issues from place to place, and then ultimately engaging those neighborhoods and finding the right intervention strategy, whether it be zoning or some other incentive or some other strategy to address those issues from place to place.
Thank you for that, but that's my point. There's no traditional communities of color. That's a misnomer. That there is no traditional communities of color. That's a created thing, right? So I'm saying, where's the data that talks about that? Because I think you just used a misnomer. I'm interested in the data that talks about where that comes from and who is creating that that misnomer that you just used, traditional communities of color.
Noted. Thank you for that. Any other?
Yes, well, I've spoken before, so go ahead. Well, to follow up with what Committee Member Hawkins was saying, I think in earlier comprehensive plans for Dallas, I mean, there has been at least somewhat of an acknowledgement that residential and heavy industry don't belong side by side. But the mitigation strategies have always focused on pretty softball recommendations, fencing, a little buffering, some landscaping. You can't buffer or fence out or plant photinias to mitigate a concrete crushing right next to a single family neighborhood. So there really needs to be a more stark realization or acknowledgement that grave injustice has been done, and it cannot be just tap danced around. That historically you get residential and industrial side by side. It's like one of those rock, paper, scissors games. The industrial always wins. And, the recommendations have been to upzone residential neighborhoods, do things like that, that theoretically makes things more compatible. But there are just situations that do not, they should not continue to exist. And I think there needs to be much stronger language, more and really rock solid land use recommendations. The city of Dallas is going to have to decide, where are these noxious industries going to be? Because it's no longer acceptable that they be next to poor neighborhoods. So.
Thank you for that.
Right. Chair, would you mind if I just stepped in for a couple of seconds? Thank you. Andrea Gillis, Assistant Director of Planning and Urban Design. I just wanted to clarify that what we're seeing today are the recommendations, and we'll certainly have sort of some introductory language to each of the themes and the recommendations. And I think we've had a lot of discussion about some of these some of the priorities, and including stronger language about these incompatibilities. And we've had that discussion through the place types. So we will make sure to include that language. But I just wanted to make sure that you're aware that there will be some additional context provided for each of these themes that we'll send out to you to digest that information. But for today, we're just going over some of the key recommendations that we want to get your thoughts on.
I'm going to touch on the last two sections, focusing on environmental protection. So a couple of my notes here is just, I know that these are bullet points to give overview, but for what's this, the updating the Article 10 to, I would say that needs to be more of a mandate than an encouragement. Just thinking about development, especially in areas of the city that may be deemed of lower value, that it's common practice just to clear cut, put up houses, but that definitely needs to be more, whatever that preservation benchmark is, needs to be more of a mandate, at least going further into the implementation, instead of just encouraging higher number of preservation of the tree canopy. Second off, when we're talking about green, so first bullet point on this last section, environmental protective use, environmentally protective land uses. What exactly are we saying? I think we all in this room know what encourage green uses on city-owned properties mean, but when we're looking at implementation, what are we defining as green uses? Are those activated parks? Are those just nicely mowed lawns? And then city departments, are those for like maintenance facilities? Can we dig into what implementation of that looks like, or how it should at least be worded in this theme?
It's a really good question, member Cannon. The lead of this theme might be able to answer that a bit more, so I may have to get you some of that information after this meeting. But in general, I think this involves taking city-owned properties and finding ways, especially to reduce the impervious surfaces, find ways to encourage more native landscaping, as well as active green uses where possible. So like trails and other ways to help restore and promote the various environmental features that we've mentioned. So like water, air, land quality. I know that we have greater detail on this item, so I'd like the opportunity to send you some more information after this meeting as to what some of the specific green uses that are being recommended could look like.
Thank you.
I will say, though, that those are really helpful comments for us. If you, to point out, because we want to make this a very, as we've said before, I want to make this an implementable document. So if there is terminology, if there's language in here that you feel creates gray areas or is not explicit, that's absolutely what we want to hear so that we can flesh that out better and make it more explicit.
I think to add to that too, I know a few body members sit on other bodies as well. So how can this language help in terms of your other purviews related to land use as well?
I guess this is Jerry Hawkins again. I guess that's my question too. Is I saw that other plans were mentioned. There's also a racial equity plan, and I didn't see that mentioned as one of the plans. And I'm interested in how the language that's in some of those plans are being used in this plan. And I also I'm interested in the lack of the ability to talk about some of these issues as well. Some of these issues are on the City of Dallas website. The one I mentioned particularly about environmental justice and injustice. I put it in the chat, but I couldn't share it to everybody. The separation of races policy that would have created communities of color, it's actually on the City of Dallas website. It was a charter from 1908 to 1968 that separated races, and it was really just white and black communities. But I mean, that stuff is already on the city website. I'm interested in it seems to be a lack of our ability to share or talk about some of these issues, and I'm interested if that's a concern or not, particularly if we're talking about environmental justice, environmental hazards. I don't know, maybe I have a little frustration.
So, Committee Member Hawkins, we have met with the Office of Equity and worked with them where possible to integrate our work. I think that they're actually quite excited about many of the items in this implementation plan because it's given some clear articulation to issues they've identified, specifically environmental justice and housing accessibility. So we do have an active dialogue with that department, and we'll make sure that we incorporate any important linkage between those metrics and items and the plan here. The other thing I just want to reiterate is that we're covering specific action recommendations for the plan in this discussion. The broader context of racial inequality within the City of Dallas isn't really the overarching topic for today, although certainly, as you said, it sort of hangs in the air of everything that we're talking about. I've certainly been a student and follower of these topics for at least 20 years in the City of Dallas. I care very deeply and I'm quite aware of the spatialized racial inequality in the city, as well as many of the other planners in our department. So I do think you will see, as we've mentioned before, you will see more of that context in the draft plan itself, as well as it's already been incorporated into the existing conditions report. So the issues of equity, racial inequality, and those impacts in our neighborhood, how that racial inequality was constructed through policy at multiple scales, is definitely acknowledged. It will be referenced in the plan. So just as I'm pointing out today, what we're trying to talk about specifically is the implementation of our land use component. So that's kind of why we're sort of focused talking in that way. But your discussion points about the broader issues of inequality certainly are essential to keeping in mind as we talk about this.
Well, thank you for that explanation. That explanation doesn't suffice because land use was used by race, but I get what you're saying. So thank you.
Any other comments or questions on this theme? I will say time check wise, we probably do need to move to another theme here pretty soon.
I just have one thing I'd like to point out. Under your update Article 10 to encourage greater tree canopy preservation, I think that's going to be in conflict a little bit with the theme of promoting economic development in certain parts of town, because, you know, the existing mature tree canopy is mostly in the southern sector. And I know when we did a revision of Article 10, however many years ago that's been, there's a lot of, you know, back and forth about the value of trees versus the need for economic development. So I just see, you know, some tension there that may erupt. I don't know what's going to happen there.
Thank you for that. I think in particular, what, you know, we have the urban forest master plan, which we try to interface with here. So it's really a citywide strategy to maintain canopy coverage. And some of the issues I've heard about Article X are just making sure that not just the number of trees, but the kind of trees and the kind of trees that encourage more of the canopy. So I think it's really about finding ways, as you said, to balance economic development and new development with protection of the tree canopy, and just making sure that new development helps maintain that canopy to the degree possible. So, but thank you for that feedback.
Let me just add to that. This is Linda McMahon. We were very involved in all that negotiation regarding Article 10. I've heard that this is going to be surfacing again for us to relook at it, but there is a great concern about the balance of issues of the economic development needs and the types of trees, specifically whether they're valuable trees or whether they're what some people call trash trees, and the value of that on a piece of property in order to be able to house another various factors. So just wanted to weigh in, because that will be something we'll be weighing in on this organization.
Thank you for that. I'm sorry, I missed a few of the words in your response. Was there a question in there, or was that just a comment?
It was a comment only. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Committee Member McMahon. All right, I'm going to go ahead and move on to our next theme. Why don't we go ahead and talk about housing accessibility? So again, this involves primarily finding ways to work with the housing department. We know that affordable housing is an issue, but also affordable housing at, I'm sorry, I want to do a pause and, all right. So in general, this theme refers to housing accessibility, making sure that there is housing at the appropriate income levels, but also placed in the most useful parts of the city. And it's that latter piece that we're really concerned with is placement of housing and working with housing to align land use planning with housing. So I've already kind of covered through some of these items, and the other item has to do with trying to mitigate displacement as new development takes place. So I'll go ahead and pause here and see if we have any questions or thoughts on this item.
This is Linda
Okay,
McMahon.
so one comment.
Only a comment. You know, as part of some of the land use planning meetings we've had with some communities, there is some rejection, particularly when we looked at the West Oak Cliff area plan, of adding more density even in a single family like duplex or, you know, small multifamily context. And you know, it's really important that we have to figure out how we embrace density, because if we don't embrace density, we're not going to be able to add more housing units. And so this is a really super important issue relative to the land use, and in my mind, one of the most important parts of all of this. Yeah. The ability to have small moves in density in some of these considered to be single families, something that's really very important for us to be able to handle the supply issue that we really got to.
I appreciate that, Committee Member McMahon. You were breaking up towards the end, but I think we have a general sense of what you were saying. I do think that's a really critical issue, and it goes beyond just this implementation component that has to do with the place type map itself and the place type descriptions. We definitely know that the term density is a loaded concept, and while we realize citywide there's going to be a great demand, there currently is and will continue to be a great demand for additional housing. Then you have individual neighborhoods say, well, not here. But I think in particular, what we like to reiterate is that a lot of times when we talk about new housing, we're not talking about, typically speaking, tearing out a traditional single family neighborhood and building apartments. What we're really talking about is finding strategic underutilized locations, really are the low hanging fruit for new housing. So transit oriented development areas, job centers, but also commercial corridors. This is a strategy that a lot of other major cities have been using, ways that really preserve neighborhood character. There's a lot of land in this city. There's not really a lot of need to go into single family neighborhoods, but there certainly are a lot of underutilized commercial corridors, DART stations. There are sections of the city that certainly are primed to absorb more of the housing. So there's also creative ways in some neighborhoods to find additional housing strategies like accessory dwelling units, or maybe considering duplexes or townhomes. So again, some neighborhoods are most likely to remain exactly as they are, but there are some neighborhoods that could maybe see a duplex or see a quadplex. There are some corridors or DART stations that could see quite a bit more multifamily. So really the question is about finding ways to appropriately manage the growth of our housing sector in ways that align with the values and goals of the city and what we've heard from the community. So I appreciate your feedback.
I would like to make a point, and this is kind of referencing previous rulings that I've been a part of with the Board of Adjustment regarding ADUs. I think that's actually a great source for potential affordable housing in the future. However, it's kind of the mindset of at least the panel I sit on to deed restrict all ADU projects. So, which is unfortunate because once the owner, if they sell or they, however they vacate the property, there is that limitation on what that ADU could serve. So now it could be a granny flat, but 10 years from now, when we might want to rent that out to a new artist coming to town, there is that issue. So we want to have that to be a part of this, promoting this theme here of how do we look at how the city is looking at ADU projects now, so that they're not restricted from the housing stock in the future.
Do you have any recommendations?
Yeah, so recommendations is that, at least for now, and I think this is just still dealing with the mindset, if it's a limited deed restriction, so at least maybe 1 to 2 years to get construction of the structure up, but then after that, it's no longer just you have to use it as the homeowner. And that way, if the homeowner were to sell or they needed to rent it out in the future for long term, I know we have to be with a 12-month lease, that they're able to do so with ease. So I'd say that's one recommendation, that the Board of Adjustment that's given more of a positive option. So as we're ruling on these matters, it's not either or. It's you can, but let's look at a restriction very short term.
Thank you, Committee Member Cannon. And as I mentioned before, there'll be opportunity to receive feedback offline as well. So any other feedback you have from your perspective on the Board of Adjustment, I think would be really useful as well.
Yeah, on accessory dwelling units needs its entire own. I think it was supposed to go to ZOAC sometime after short-term rentals were addressed, which has recently happened. But things about deed restrictions and owner occupancy requirements are basically killed the ADUs as a development tool at all. It's my opinion that they should be allowed by right in any neighborhood, because if you can't, an accessory dwelling unit is the least smallest possible increment of housing that can be added to an area. So if you're not going to accept that, you're not going to accept anything. So there's no reason to restrict that if we're talking about trying to grow the housing base.
Thank you for that feedback, member.
Vice Chair Carpenter?
Yes.
I think this is more of a question, or just some thinking out loud, but we have a separate goal for urban design, which is I think 3 or 4 down the list. Where do design, I mean, particularly with the MMH, do we need to acknowledge some form of design standards? Not something super onerous within the housing accessibility, recognizing that as we work to potentially incorporate missing middle into various areas, that there may need to be some tweaking of design standards, potentially loosening in some areas and restricting in other areas to really figure out how to make missing middle work as a practical matter. I can think of some existing challenges that we face with some of the requirements that we have for duplexes, which kind of make them a little more challenging to integrate into some areas. So I don't know if there's that bottom sub point way down at the bottom, provide urban design in other areas of housing. I'm not sure if that was also included missing middle, but I don't know if we need some sort of design standards acknowledgement here as well, so we can think about how to best integrate missing middle. So that's just more musing. I don't know if there's a direct question or anything there, but wanted to get that out there.
Thank you, Chair Rubin. Just a couple points on that, and maybe Lawrence can elaborate on this. But I think so. Right now, the urban design standards are addressed at least in a couple of ways. You've mentioned one of them. One is obviously through the place type descriptions and through the urban design component of the plan, which will apply across the board, and certainly to housing and how it should be incorporated within the neighborhood. You mentioned down below, there is the mention about the housing NOFA. So to the extent that missing middle involves public subsidy, we're certainly hoping to be involved with the housing department and looking at design standards, as well as the land bank program, which might actually be one of the sources of land for some of this missing middle. So we've looked at finding ways that the land bank program can be used not just for detached single family, but possibly for attached or possibly for multifamily. But I will say, you mentioned duplexes in particular. So whether you provide feedback now or offline, I actually, if you have further thoughts on the issues you've encountered specifically with duplexes or other missing middle categories, I think we'd love to hear some of those specific issues as well.
I won't bore everyone here. I'll get you my comments offline.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I do have a question about, or some comments to make about the bullet point that says align land use tools such as NSOs, historic districts, and CDs with anti-displacement toolkit. Is there any consideration being given to increase this arsenal of land use tools? I mean, historic districts and conservation districts work for particular kinds of neighborhoods, but NSOs have had problems in being initiated, at least in the southern sector where we have terrain. The way the ordinance is written right now, it works best in neighborhoods that are perfectly flat and have very cookie cutter sizes of lots. But if you have, some variety, right, then all of a sudden you're told that the NSO won't apply in your neighborhood because, the setbacks vary if you're on a hill as opposed to a flat surface. And then we've also had issues, particularly in the La Bajada NSO, with height, the way height is measured according to the city. And it, what they thought they were accomplishing in writing their NSO is not accomplished stabilizing the character of their area, because all of a sudden, massively bigger, completely different types of housing are going in that are selling for much higher prices and are causing, it's just not helping. So I guess my question is is there any plan to look at introducing, a different or softening the requirements for NSOs or simplifying the way these can be implemented for neighborhoods that don't meet the criteria right now? That's a question for Ms. Gillis, I imagine.
Yes, I am deeply in the weeds on NSOs right now, and thinking about how we update the ordinance to, one, make it more user-friendly from a process perspective. I think the process is antiquated from what we ask residents to do and measure, and how we even get those measurements. So we've been talking internally about a code amendment to do an overhaul of that section of the code, not only to update process, but then update the standards within the allowable standards within that ordinance to make it more usable and applicable to issues that we're seeing today. So, largely the NSO is about setbacks and height, and that's pretty much all you can address. And height, there's a pretty high threshold that you need to get of people to sign on to it to even address height. So I think, 15 years later, after the ordinance was adopted, we're seeing different issues. So we want to provide an expanded mix of issues that can be addressed through the neighborhood stabilization ordinance in a much more user-friendly manner. So yes, that is absolutely on our radar and something that we are working to prioritize to start bringing through the code amendment process.
Thank you.
And just time check, we're coming up on 10. So it might be good to move on, but I do want to pause to see if we have any additional pressing comments or questions about this theme. All right.
Hey, Brian, and I think in terms of just time, I think the urban design theme, we can move that to the next conversation since that's going to be entirely on urban design. So that might be a good.
So skip it for today? Yeah, right. No problem. I'm actually gonna, so I'm gonna jump ahead to TOD, and then we'll come back to economic development. So I'm just gonna go ahead and open this up for questions. I've already kind of overviewed some of the items here. One reminder, part of the core of this idea is planning and urban design, working to have a concerted land use strategy around TOD. So essentially a kind of prioritization matrix. So identifying which TODs and understanding the different kinds of stations and TOD opportunities that exist, the nature of land use conditions on the ground, as well as locating opportunities from our partners, like where DART is working, where housing might be looking at for their target areas, and just trying to align land use changes with the work they're doing, and finding ways to draw housing and development in ways that improve connectivity and from a CCAP standpoint, reduce vehicle mile travels as well. So I'll just a quick reminder on the nature of this theme.
Could you elaborate as to what develop a freight master plan means? Is it rail or trucking or is it designated truck routes? I'm not sure what this is.
I think it has to do with rail in particular. Lawrence?
Yes, it's all inclusive of freight. So that includes rail, that includes heavy trucks. It's all inclusive of that.
So would the master plan have as a goal designated truck routes through the city?
Yes. So basically, one thing that we're definitely looking at is post for Dallas. There's going to definitely need to be an update to our thoroughfare master plan. And part of that update is to also look at the freight, how that is also integrated with that update.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lawrence. Other questions or comments on transit-oriented development and accessibility?
Just a quick question on the potential thoroughfare plan update. What does that look like? Is that along with the development code update? Is that a separate effort through starting with the
That'd be
CPC's thoroughfare
that'd be
committee?
totally separate.
Okay,
From a transportation department, yes. So we're still coordinating, like what we're doing right now with the land use plan. We're coordinating with them in terms of what's happening on the ground from a land use perspective. Land use and transportation are tied at the hip, so we are
sure.
talking through what that would look like within their department after Fort Dallas. But they'll be the ones to lead that.
And is
So
that something that we
question,
have
just-
the, sorry,
No, you go ahead.
is that something that we have the
Chairman.
resources, currently to do in-house, or is that, something that council would need to authorize and approve potentially hiring an outside consultant to do?
Yes, I guess transportation staff would be able to provide the direction, the best way of going forward with that, and then council will be the one to determine which way and what funds or resources are needed to get that completed.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
So thoroughfare is completely, hold on, as I'm understanding what I'm hearing, so that's a different plan entity outside of the transportation overlay that we hold on, can you just repeat all that? Because what I'm getting at here is that I would see if we're incorporating looking at the thoroughfare plan now, that could be an opportunity to tie in with some of these other themes like green spaces, depending on the width of the thoroughfare. So I mean, I guess, sorry, I heard bits and pieces of what you're saying, but
Right.
help me
No,
understand how that ties in.
great point. So in terms of how we're looking at land use and transportation, the most, I guess, recent transportation network or plan that transportation has provided us is their complete street manual. That's being tied into the urban design framework that we're developing, and we'll show you all next time. As we're updating the land use component, transportation is also going to need to be updated. So after Fort Dallas, we're going to be coordinating with transportation to see what certain corridors or what that infrastructure needs to look like to be updated citywide, because we're going to be providing an update for them to do their update and go out and do that as well.
Any other questions or comments on this theme? All right, we will move to, oh, sorry, one second. Encouraging strategic economic development and revitalization. And just to point out, this theme is still in, I'd say, a bit more active development. We're still working with economic development to make sure we effectively leverage their resources, and they've also recently adopted a strategic plan. So a couple of these items might still be in flux, but I can certainly address any questions or thoughts we have on this theme right now. I would say in general, economic development primarily as an implementing body to plans, they're certainly looking to Fort Dallas as well as other area neighborhood plans for direction. So some of the main strategic areas we've discussed with them are transit-oriented development areas, environmental justice issues, as well as corridor planning. So I think there's a lot of productive room for us to better align land use zoning change with areas that they are providing active programs and incentives towards. Any questions or comments on this theme?
Question
I have a
here.
question.
So in other themes, we talk about collaboration with city and DART. I think that part of this should be collaboration between city and the Dallas ISD. If we're talking about economic development, I want to set up business, there's always a thing of I want to be in good neighborhoods. So my workforce, incorporating that element or bringing them into the conversation, I think would be very helpful, especially if we're talking southern sector development. How do we get schools on par, or I'm not saying that we're drafting education policy here, but that I don't know the answer to that yet, but I do believe that stakeholders should be part if we're talking about economic development.
Thank you very much for that feedback. Just out of curiosity, any other specific ways you think DISD might play into planning? I just want to make sure
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking too, so what's the existing, I mean, I guess, okay, if we're talking land use, we want to attract businesses, we want to make it, worthwhile for them to set up shop in these areas that we're targeting here. But then what does workforce development look like in this area? So that I'm thinking, okay, not only, Dallas is great at attracting businesses, but also what's our homegrown workforce here? And I think that's where we tie in the public schools. And I'm sure there's a program out there some way, somehow, but that needs to be a part of this conversation too. That's, yeah. And again, I'm not your education policy person here, but tying in who are we cranking out of our schools, especially in these areas, and then for those that are relocating to businesses that we want to set up in these targeted areas.
Yeah, I'll say, Committee Member Cannon, that's a fantastic comment. I will say we have met with DISD in the past, and they've certainly been interested in finding ways to partner with entities such as DART or DHA or the City of Dallas. They have different educational models for some of their schools that work to create more mixed economic racial contexts. So sometimes what we've talked about in the past is finding ways to align where they are building new institutions or where they want to target specific models of schools in alignment with transit and housing development as well. So I certainly think there's a lot of productivity. The other piece is green space and safety and walkability, and just in general, the physical environment around these schools. I know that Texas Tree Foundation has certainly done some really good work from a nonprofit side, providing trees and playground equipment and helping to activate some of that land for the neighborhoods as well. So I think DISD is certainly essential to any conversation around land use. So your feedback about making sure we've thoroughly worked with them through this process is well received. So thank you. Other questions or comments on?
Another comment, just point of information. This is Linda McMahon. There is growing interest in turning land that's owned by Dallas College as well as the ISD into providing land for housing purposes. There's more and more conversation around that. And so we should incorporate, if we're talking about DISD, we're also talking about Dallas College, which is another significant landowner. And they are actively having conversations about how to utilize their excess land.
Thank you for that, Committee Member McMahon. Yeah, there's DISD, there's Dallas College, there's other educational entities as well within the City of Dallas. I'd be interested to check back in with housing to see the ways they've engaged with with educational institutions around this. So, but thank you for that elaboration.
I have a question on, this is Matt Houston, under the incentivized economic development equity subtopic, seeing the supporting the environmental justice initiatives. Is that similar to the larger discussion we had earlier today? And is this using the traditional community types is which we're referring?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the last part? Traditional what?
The traditional community of color that you all referred to in the original environmental thing. Was that the same data point for this subtopic?
For sure, and I'll clarify based on feedback. The term traditional communities of color is a misnomer apparently. So apologies for using that. We certainly know that these environments were constructed and created through public policy and other mechanisms. But to your point about this last objective around economic development and equity, there's a couple points here to make. One is that the economic development policy itself heavily focuses on economic development in the southern sector and other areas of the city. I do think that what we refer to here partly is when we partner with economic development around neighborhood planning and land use planning, we want to make sure that when we do neighborhood and area planning in areas like these that we are incorporating economic development and their policy and commitment to encourage economic development in these parts of the city. So we just want to make sure we better coordinate where we plan, where land use changes take place, and their incentives and programs that are devoted towards economic development to traditionally underserved neighborhoods. The other piece about environmental justice, so they have a new brownfields program. They reference the potential of developing other incentives. So we just want to make sure that economic development is at the table in environmental justice conversations. So as we look to transition certain uses away or transition them towards cleaner uses, that where possible, we can work to provide city incentive programs as one possible toolkit of many in these areas. Does that sort of begin to answer your question, Committee Member Houston?
It does. Thank you. I just want to make it known that there are some dots that we'll need when we address one issue. It'll affect something like EcoDev as well.
Thank you very much. Other comments or questions on this theme? All right. And then, we are bypassing urban design for this discussion. There will be an entire meeting on this, but just as sort of a point on this, the idea is that ultimately, in addition to refining those urban design principles for the city, having a citywide map, the idea is that through the implementation plan, we make sure those standards are incorporated into key city processes and programs. So all of this will be reviewed in a separate meeting. So I just wanted to reiterate sort of the nature of the implementation of this element. But what I'm going to do is skip to this final theme, rural and agricultural and greenfield areas. And so in general, I think the idea here is that there are areas of the city that are less developed, particularly in the far southern, southeast, southwest portions of the city. So we've heard quite a bit of feedback from these communities from the beginning of the process around trying to address the traditional lack of infrastructure, amenities, concerns about the character and nature of new development in these areas, and also ways to potentially provide space for agriculture and environmental preservation. So really there's an opportunity in some of these what might be called underdeveloped areas of the city, not just to think about it as land to be developed, but also as sort of a canvas for us to consider, how do we as a city want to make use of this space? So how can we balance environmental preservation and new development in a way that balances these factors we've heard? So I'll pause here and see if we have any comments on this item.
I would like to comment on where it says update development code to allow for more agricultural production, improve agricultural zone to be more functional. I mean, my understanding has always been that the agricultural zoning was really a kind of a placeholder to reflect the fact that the city really wasn't prepared to make the infrastructure investments to have it be anything else, that it wasn't necessarily a statement of intentionality that the area should always remain agricultural. And, right now, sitting on CPC, what I see are, a sort of a relentless onslaught of zoning cases that want to, what the development community is pursuing down here is warehousing and commercial motor vehicle parking, which doesn't really seem to correspond either to what's stated here or to the sentiments of the people who live there. So I'm a little confused about I understand that there are areas that are, small farm type developments, but are we really trying to, it says here that we want to allow for more agricultural production and improve the agricultural zone to be more functional, but is that the intention, to have it be agricultural?
So I have a couple thoughts on this. I have not been super deep in the weeds personally on the agricultural component, so maybe Lawrence or Andrea can speak to this. But so we have a recently adopted agricultural plan. They kind of partnered with us in some of our engagement meetings around this. So my understanding is really more from the urban agricultural standpoint, and that's that a lot of the zoning codes traditionally have not allowed for community gardens or other small scale agricultural within residential and other neighborhood contexts. So I think the other idea is that you're correct. The agricultural zone as it currently exists has often been a kind of a bizarre placeholder that has not reflected what's on the ground. So I certainly think that the goal is to, as we work to update the development code moving forward, to make sure that that kind of placeholder misalignment is removed from the equation, and that the agricultural zone is used more intentionally for actual agricultural production. So I apologize, that's a half answer. So I'm going to see if Lawrence has something else to add to the conversation.
Right, I think Brian kind of touched on kind of 2 big points. I'm sorry. So I guess first point that you mentioned, that current zoning classification is that kind of placeholder. This item kind of touches on the fact that we want to basically use the development code update to clarify that particular land use and zoning classification to be used for agricultural purposes and not just a placeholder. So that's kind of one of the feedback that we've heard, is that residents do want to use their land to use for agriculture. So being able to be clear with where that's located in the city through the zoning code update, that's a component of what we're looking at here. 2, looking at these themes, again, all these themes are still being massaged as we're having conversations. We've identified a particular place type that's focused just on this. So we're looking to see not just how that particular place type is used, where in the city that's going to be located. So I think the place type also addresses some of these issues that we're looking at in terms of the location of where we want to see this, because we're still getting feedback that this is a particular use that's desired. So I want to make sure we're addressing that and doing so not just with the identification for Dallas, but also through the code component that gets updated after this.
I'm thinking that this particular item right now is kind of blending 2 different goals, because you have I'll just use Kleberg Riley as an example, where you have historically a more rural residential type place type. And then we have just I guess it's 3 issues. And then you have the larger issue where you have just agricultural zoning overlaid on a big part of the city that doesn't necessarily, or it doesn't really reflect either what's currently there or what the intentionality is. And then you also have the what I understand to be kind of for the entire city, a desire to kind of squeeze in, infill some urban agriculture, which is to allow the community gardens and the urban farms and that sort of thing. And that would not be just in these rural residential parts of town, but across. So I'm thinking we got a little bit of a hodgepodge here.
Commissioner Carpenter, I appreciate that. I wrote your 3-point framework. I might end up stealing that if that's all right.
It's not copyrighted.
No, I think that's a wonderful breakdown. So yeah, that's part of the issue of having to summarize these in 1 bullet point. But I think this is exactly the kind of feedback we want to hear, that we can make sure this is articulated in the outcome. I think all 3 of those examples are exactly what we want to address. Part of it is certainly making sure that in any sort of rural zoning category, making sure that agriculture is effectively allowed and regulated. It's also about making sure the agricultural zoning code is not misused in the way that you describe. And then thirdly, yes, it's about how can the development code encourage, as you said, infill or community scale gardening and agriculture. So all 3 of those issues are designed to be incorporated. So I appreciate that feedback, and I'm sure those specific items will ultimately be reflected through the plan.
So I've got a question here on, this is on the second, the environmental conservation. When I think agriculture, this is, so for the scales of agriculture here, but for not your community gardens, or I guess that would be under urban agriculture, but how are we addressing water consumption if we're this theme is, I guess, we're looking to promote more scales of agriculture in the city of Dallas. So for your mid to larger size, needs to be addressed. Okay, water consumption to keep these operations going, and then also, back to the theme of environmental justice, sustainability. What does runoff control look like? So if that's anywhere from fertilizer to waste, that's, how are we regulating that? I get that urban farms, I like that idea more because you have, it's more of a tighter scale as far as what can be controlled, what's being grown or what's being raised. But then when you're talking about these more larger expanses of land, then I feel like that's going to bump into that theme of the environmental justice. If you want to place a farm somewhere, yes, that's great for business, but then literally the downstream from that could be an issue that we need to work out in this.
Absolutely, Member Cannon. And I will say the issue of sustainability of agricultural practices is certainly important, if not maybe a couple steps beyond where we are right now. But I will say that I would say probably in terms of water consumption overall, my guess would be that agricultural uses is definitely much lower on the list of users of water within the city. We're certainly concerned about water runoff from impervious surfaces. We're concerned about landscaping, use of water, encouraging more xeriscaping native plants. But I think to your point specifically about water within agriculture, I would actually need to get back to you a bit more. I'm not sure if the urban agricultural plan actually includes a sort of a best practice or a guide to recommendations for water in those uses. That's one of those things I'd have to get back to you on. But the comment's well taken. I think we need to be absolutely concerned about water consumption in all of our land uses. I will say that, I think about Bonton Farms as one example. They have their main store down there at their main location, but they also have a larger farm off-site. So I do think there might be desire for additional agricultural space within the city. So we want to make sure that water consumption and fertilizing, other sustainability practices within agriculture are encouraged. So again, sorry for the half answer there, but what I can do is get back to you and review the urban agricultural plan and talk to a couple of the folks on the team that are a bit more involved in this conversation.
And I can add a bit to that, and I'll just time check too. I think we have 8 minutes for this meeting. So related to kind of water consumption that you mentioned, that just brought the topic of kind of metrics that we're looking at for Forward Dallas. So there's mentioned a bunch of topics, a bunch of different issues and themes, and some of those could or might seem perceptively to be contrary from each other. So what we're doing, we're measuring things like water consumption, walkability, energy use, residential affordability, VMTs, daily trips, parking demand, living factors, including access to employment, transit, health and food, access to jobs, population, residential units, and non-residential single family. So all of those are metrics that we're looking at with our consultant, because they're the more experts with looking at kind of scenarios of how different land uses affect all of those topics. So part of the plan that we're going to be hopefully publishing in the fall is providing a dashboard of sorts where users can go in and see the different land use mixes per the different themes we're talking about and how those affect those different metrics. So for example, if you're going to Kleberg, Riley area, looking at the land composition, being able to understand what that particular place type composition does from a walkability, water consumption perspective, and then staff will be able to go back and tweak those and see what changes, what metrics change based on some land use changes and tweaks. So we'll have the ability to do that in the fall. We'll be publishing that for the public to see, just to kind of like see how we're going to be analyzing future feedback. But that's something we're definitely taking into consideration as we're thinking about the different land uses that exist.
Any other comments or questions on this theme? All right, we have just a couple minutes, so let me just see, are there any final comments or questions about the implementation plan as a whole? And just as a reminder, we will be sending this out, so you'll have an opportunity to provide further feedback in the coming days as well.
So you did say that we're going to have a separate meeting on urban design. Will that be our next meeting?
That is the plan, yes.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right, I just want to thank everyone. As Andrea mentioned earlier, all of this feedback has been really helpful. It's really helpful for us to make sure that we are articulating the intent of these items and explaining them and avoiding terminology that's too vague. So it is certainly our intention with this implementation plan to be precise in what we mean and who's supposed to assist in which components and what exactly is supposed to be done. So we have a lot of good feedback here to help expand and elaborate and explore on these topics, and look forward to further feedback from this body in the coming days and weeks on the implementation plan. So thank you very much for this item, and I will hand this back over to.
If you go to the second to last slide.
Yeah, can you confirm our next meeting?
Right, yes.
Thank you.
So that, you're welcome. Now pull up my calendar too.
While he confirms the next meeting, just FYI, next steps. We are currently in development of the draft plan and the map update number 3 for this month and July. The urban design framework review, which Lawrence is about to speak to.
Yeah, I was going to speak to this whole slide.
Oh, you were going to take this one? Okay.
Yes. So staff work currently, like I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the meeting, we're currently looking at all the comments up to date to update the map, the future land use map number 3. So we're hoping to get that published early July. Yes, we're in June. So that's the idea. We're currently working on that now. Everybody's feverishly reviewing and making sure we're addressing all the comments. So our next meeting, July 11th, that's the second week of July. We're going to be focusing on the urban design framework. We put here mid-July. So we'll confirm everybody's able to make that meeting, but that's where we are proposing to have our next meeting. Before the end of the month, we're going to be sending out kind of a confirmed rest of the year calendar for the body, and also publishing that online for our community members and stakeholders. Coming late July, it should be late July, early August, we will be talking through the draft of the plan. So all the information and the feedback that we received in the meetings we've had so far are basically components of the plan that we're providing to you all piecemeal to get feedback as we refine and put it together and package it together for you all to review as well. So that will be, we're going to be planning to have that drafted by early August, and then having a public comment period to go through the fall, August, September-ish. So that's kind of our draft plan and project schedule for the next few months. As we have these conversations, we'll continue to refine that just based on the feedback we get and directions that are needed from you all and executive leadership as well. Any questions just on this list of next steps? I know we don't have specific dates, but the next meeting we'll confirm that that's going to be July 11th. Just to confirm with everybody that's available to attend. I know a few people might be out based on vacation. All right, if no questions, I'll hand that back to Brian, and then conclude the meeting with Commissioner Carpenter.
All right, I think we're ready for the final item on the agenda, which is to approve the meeting minutes from June 13th, 2023. Could I have a motion to approve?
I, Joe Cannon, move to approve the minutes from June 13th, 2023.
Thank you, Member Cannon. Second?
I will second that.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett.
Please
all in
correct
favor?
Please correct Jennifer Scripps' name spelling.
All right, that's noted. So we have a motion to approve, and it's seconded to approve the meeting minutes from June 13th, 2023 with one revision, which is the correcting of the spelling of committee member Jennifer Scripps' name. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? The meeting minutes are approved. I don't believe I need a motion to adjourn, so I will just announce that this meeting is adjourned as of 10:29. Thank you, everyone.
Have a good one.
Thank you, everybody.